Alright, reassembly time. I am actually going to change real quick because when I got this part of the bracket off for the fuel tank, I noticed these two screws, so I'm going to actually pop these two screws out here and put this bracket on before the rest of the engine goes on top of the pedestal here, and then attach the fuel tank and everything last. But this means I have better access to these screws. The fuel tank bracket and the screw with the ignition bracket. And since these are very tiny screws, 1.5 millimeter hex heads, and they're in brass, we're barely finger tight. It's more than tight enough for them. And since I've got this apart, we'll wipe it real good before we continue putting set that in place and push the connecting rod through there. And now turn this way and take our cylinder and put two of our mounting bolts in it so we're ready with that. Take our wrist pin and piston. There we go. Feel that in place until it sets. And then the piston, the slope is up. And those two screws are kitty corner from each other. Put them in so. And as you can see, I did a lot of model engineering before I owned tweezers or any of the other very excellent things that we have for manipulating tiny bolts. So I got very good at holding the head of the bolt against the screwdriver and dropping it into the hole that I need it to hit. So, alright. And again, these bolts are all very tiny and going into brass, so I'm like the tiniest finger tight. That's part of why I'm only gripping this driver with a couple fingers, because the better the grip you have, the more it encourages you to crank on things. So that's more than sturdy enough there. Now we need to bolt the bottom, quote-unquote bottom, since this is usually in a vertical engine, down, the bottom end in place. So, and this is the tough part, since the flywheel floats in that bottom bearing. We gotta very carefully lift it. Come on, you. There we go. Get it to lift so that that matches up, and then try to get, there we go. Get one of these screws to start, and then definitely leave all these incredibly loose until the rest of them are in place. And you'll notice I started with the left and right. You can start with any that you want, but especially for a lineup like this where there's the weight there holding it down, you want to get opposite side pairs started first, and that will line up the rest of your screws and bolt holes much more quickly than if you try to just go in order, pick a spot and work clockwise or counterclockwise. The last one, and of course the last one, all the others just sort of pop in place, no problem. The last one doesn't want to behave. Of course, I'm balancing it on the end of my, there we go, balancing it on the end of the driver and trying to get it in place while the camera sees it, and which is the quote-unquote wrong side for the way that I usually work. So, alright, now tighten all these, and I'm just snugging them, and then I'm going to treat this set of bolts, like every time you have a bolt circle like this, you should just treat it like a head bolt pattern and tighten across in pairs as you work. Of course, again, since these are such tiny screws in brass, not actually tightening, just trying to get everything even. So now this, I don't know how well this shows up on camera, but the end of this casting here is smooth, but it does have some discoloration and pitting. So I'm actually considering whether I should have taken a closer look at that and tried to polish it a little bit, because this, just like the ET engines where the cylinder liner set in and then the outer cylinder was standing proud and reducing compression, I wonder if any of this is doing the same thing with that cylinder liner. But I do have decent compression, so I'm gonna just hope that it is good and that's not interfering with anything. I'm going to try and very carefully wipe this O-ring and then push it into that groove. These two head bolts on the opposite sides, since I can hold it in place and finger start them. There. And when you put the head on with those O-rings for the head gasket, you want to make sure that you put it in place and don't make a gap or move the head around, because if it accidentally displaces the O-ring, that O-ring was in that groove, and if it pops out of that groove and then you tighten this head down, it will cut that O-ring, or make it lumpy and weird. So alright, those are all in place. So it's time to start putting the side of the engine back on. In place, and then, okay, double check that that rod isn't getting fouled in there so that I can attach it to the camshaft again. And the O-ring on the back of this valve assembly was very nicely seated, so I'm not really worried about it moving. But oh. I there's an extra hole. There's an extra hole in that engine casting right here, and when I blind inserted this bolt, it went into that extra hole. So I guess be careful about the spare hole. Oh, I totally missed the... That's what happened. Totally missed the valve assembly when I tried to do it blind. So that's what happened. Alright, well, another thing we learned, double check the valve assembly as we put it in. And not worried that that O-ring moved while I was fumbling around, because it looks like the gap is pretty even here. So that's a good indicator that everything is okay. Now, let's get that valve rod up there, and then slip the lever for the exhaust valve rod into place. Not on there, and give it the tiniest turn so that we barely feel the lock nut engage. Tightening this and making sure it still moves freely. There. That's the exact amount for that. Put the bolt in the ignition, or in the intake rod spot here. The challenge is that this is tight in there, but I also need to make sure that it's tight, because it's supposed to be, and not tight because I cross-threaded it. So two of these, and they're very similar, so we'll trade, and that one went in very, very easy, so I got lucky, or these are in fact matched in a way that I didn't know. And that feels like it's moving okay. I get my big end strap back on here so that I'm not banging on the big end anymore. Yep, that seems to be turning okay. It's hard to tighten these all the way and make sure you're not binding that, because you have to be really careful feeling as you turn this and watching this rod go to make sure that it doesn't bind. And then this lever, we have to pull that, this lever up to make sure that it's pressing on the exhaust valve when we put this linkage in, because if we let it hang down and accidentally assemble it like this backwards, then it obviously will not hit the exhaust valve. So a lot of, so I'm holding the, tap it up against the valve and putting this in place, and feels good. Feels nice and tight, except it's not flipping the valve open, so give it a little loosen it a bit. A bit more there. Maybe let this lever up a little bit more. There. There we go. Now when I pull this lever, it's got a good snap from the valve shutting. I had this marginally too tight and that marginally too tight, so it felt okay, but then the spring on the exhaust valve couldn't push the whole mechanism backwards. So, alright. Take our O-ring for our exhaust valve and seat it in there. Put it in place there and press it and hold it so that the O-ring doesn't move. And get our two bolts in there. Like I said, I have a sneaky suspicion the balance problem is related to putting that exhaust pointed the other way. And now we'll get our intake. Alright, is one side of this elbow longer? Nope, that elbow is plain. Maybe that is the problem I'm having with this engine. So you can see when I assemble this and push this together, the elbow and this O-ring are not actually sticking into the carburetor anymore to cause a seal. So that is the problem. That seal is not happening anymore. Alright, and the exhaust was tapping on the fuel tank there. But that's the thing I need to sort out. That O-ring is not sticking into the carburetor on the backside. We have a massive air leak there. That is why the engine runs and then suddenly seems to get no fuel and quits. So I will need to make a plan to solve that. Because, yeah, a massive air leak in the intake like that definitely makes the mix basically impossible to adjust consistently. Alright, well, we did figure out a new problem with the engine. It's still very exciting, the quality of it. Just a small design thing. That elbow, if one side was longer than the other, then maybe some of these engines would assemble and it wouldn't fit because it would stick too far out and push on that fuel tank. So we'll have to come up with something. And I don't know what that is right now, but I'll give it some thought and then we'll be back when I have a plan.